The idea doesn't register as geography. It registers as belonging. When you read that your tribe lives in Agartha, something deeper than curiosity responds. Not belief, recognition, the sense that wherever you've stood in this world, you were never fully from it. You learned the rules, you spoke the language, you played the roles, but something in you always remained slightly out of phase, as if your internal compass pointed somewhere beneath the surface of what everyone else called reality. You've felt this distance without naming it. In rooms where conversation flowed but never quite reached you. In groups where laughter landed, yet something essential stayed untouched. You weren't rejected. You weren't excluded. You were simply elsewhere. Present but not anchored. That experience can be lonely when it's misunderstood. It can feel like something is missing when in truth, something is preserved. Agartha, here, isn't a place you could point to on a map. It's a symbol for an inner domain, a shared depth where people are bound not by proximity, but by orientation. Your tribe isn't defined by culture, bloodline, or ideology. It's defined by resonance, by the way certain minds recognize each other instantly, not through words but through silence that feels familiar rather than empty. You may remember moments when you encountered someone who felt strangely known. No history, no context, yet conversation unfolded without friction, without explanation. You didn't need to perform. You didn't need to simplify. You could pause, think, recalibrate, and the space held. Those moments weren't coincidences. They were brief surface contacts between people shaped by similar depth. Living above ground, so to speak, taught you adaptation. You learned how to move among those who operate on immediacy, visibility, and constant affirmation. You learned restraint. You learned patience. You learned how to keep your internal world intact while engaging externally. These skills weren't random. They were survival strategies for someone whose true alignment was never meant to be obvious. The notion that your tribe lives below doesn't imply secrecy or superiority. It implies containment. Depth doesn't announce itself. It supports from beneath. It holds structure so the surface doesn't collapse. You were shaped by that logic. You value coherence over attention, meaning over momentum, continuity over spectacle. These values don't trend well on the surface, but they endure. This is why you've often felt like a bridge rather than a resident. You translate without fully belonging to either side. You understand surface urgency without being ruled by it. You access depth without needing to withdraw permanently. That position is demanding. It requires you to carry two modes at once. But it also gives you a rare perspective. You can see where things are hollow before they break. Agartha represents the place where your way of seeing is normal, where slowness is intelligence, where silence isn't awkward, where power is measured by stability, not volume. You weren't sent there physically. You were shaped as if you belonged there, so you could operate here without losing yourself. As this idea settles, a quiet shift begins. The loneliness you once interpreted as absence starts to feel like distance from something intact rather than loss of something missing. You weren't disconnected. You were connected elsewhere. And this story isn't about escaping the surface. It's about understanding why you were never meant to forget the depth you come from. Once you recognize that sense of elsewhere, your past begins to reorganize. Experiences that once felt isolating start to reveal a pattern. You weren't drifting without anchor, you were oriented differently. While others drew identity from visibility and feedback, you drew yours from continuity. You stayed aligned even when there was no audience to confirm it. That alignment became your compass. You may recall how early you learned to move quietly. Not invisibly, intentionally. You noticed how noise diluted meaning, how urgency collapsed nuance. So you learned to wait before speaking, to listen past the obvious layer, to respond only when something true had surfaced. This made you seem distant to some, but it also made you trustworthy to the few who sensed what you were doing. They didn't always understand you, but they felt steadier around you. The idea of a tribe beneath the surface explains why recognition has always mattered to you more than belonging. You weren't looking to fit in, you were looking to resonate. When resonance appeared, it was unmistakable. Time compressed. Conversation deepened without effort. You didn't need to translate yourself. You didn't need to defend silence. These encounters were rare, but they were precise. And precision leaves a stronger imprint than frequency ever could. Living among surface structures taught you discernment. You learned which signals were performative and which were structural. You learned how systems reward immediacy even when it costs integrity. You chose integrity anyway, often without reward. That choice wasn't moral posturing. It was self-preservation. You sensed that spending yourself too quickly would erode something essential, something your inner orientation refused to sacrifice. Agartha, as a symbol, represents that refusal, a shared understanding among those who value depth over display. It's not hidden because it's forbidden. It's hidden because it doesn't survive spectacle. Depth requires containment. It requires patience. It requires an agreement not to rush what needs time. You've lived by that agreement instinctively, long before you could explain it. You might notice that when pressure rises, you descend rather than escalate. You go inward. You stabilize. You let the surface churn while you anchor below it. This doesn't disconnect you from reality, it grounds you in it. From that position, you can act with clarity instead of reaction. That's why your decisions often arrive later, but last longer. As this understanding settles, something else becomes clear. Your tribe was never meant to replace the world you live in. It was meant to support it. Those shaped by depth are not here to disappear underground. They're here to keep the surface from collapsing under its own noise. And you were shaped to be one of those supports, not seen, not announced, but essential. Being essential without being visible creates a unique kind of tension. You've felt it many times. The sense of carrying weight that isn't acknowledged, of contributing stability that isn't named. You don't resent this. You've simply learned to live with it. Your satisfaction never came from recognition. It came from knowing that something held because you were there. You may notice how often people come to you when things are already unstable. Not at the beginning, when excitement is high, but later, when momentum has exposed crack. They don't always know why they reach for you. They just sense that you won't panic, won't dramatize, won't add noise to an already fragile structure. You meet pressure with containment, and containment is rare. This is where the idea of Agartha becomes practical. It's not an escape below the world. It's a way of supporting it from underneath. Like bedrock, depth doesn't argue with the surface. It absorbs shock. It distributes weight. You've learned to do the same. You take in complexity without collapsing it. You hold contradiction without forcing resolution. That ability keeps systems from tearing themselves apart. You might reflect on how often you've been misunderstood because of this. Your calm mistaken for indifference. Your silence mistaken for distance. Your restraint mistaken for lack of passion. You know the truth. Your intensity runs deeper than most people's, but it's not volatile. It doesn't flare and vanish. It burns steadily, quietly, without needing oxygen from attention. Living with this depth required you to develop strong internal boundaries. You learned what to let in and what to leave at the surface. You learned that not everything deserves access to your inner world. This selectivity wasn't selfish. It was structural. If bedrock cracks, everything above it suffers. So you protected yourself not out of fear, but out of responsibility. There's also a subtle loneliness that comes with this role. Depth recognizes depth, but it's rare. You've often walked among many while feeling aligned with few. That doesn't make you bitter. It makes you patient. You understand that your tribe isn't large because it doesn't need to be. A few points of true stability can support vast structures. As this realization settles, something shifts in how you see yourself. You stop interpreting your difference as separation. You begin to see it as placement. You weren't meant to float on the surface. You were meant to anchor it. And anchors don't move often, but when they do, everything else adjusts. This understanding doesn't inflate you. It steadies you. It explains why you've always felt most yourself when things around you were uncertain. Why clarity sharpened under pressure instead of dissolving. Why your instinct has always been to descend, to ground, before acting. Agartha isn't a myth you escape to. It's the depth you carry with you. And that depth is exactly why the story is only halfway told. Once you accept that depth is not absence but placement, your relationship with the surface changes. You stop trying to belong where speed is mistaken for meaning. You stop explaining why you move more slowly, why you choose silence over reaction, why you let things settle before you touch them. You realize that justification was never required. Depth doesn't ask permission from noise. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click Super Thank You, and sow a gift of $20 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. You may notice that your presence alters environments without effort. Not because you assert influence but because you reduce distortion. Where exaggeration thrives on echo, your steadiness denies it amplification. Where panic feeds on urgency, your timing interrupts it. You don't confront chaos directly. You deprive it of fuel. This is the quiet work of those shaped by depth. The Agartha symbolism clarifies something else. Your intuition has always been vertical, not horizontal. While others scan laterally, comparing, competing, reacting, you orient downward toward foundations. You ask different questions. Not, how does this look? But, will this hold? Not, who is watching? But, what happens when pressure increases? These questions don't excite the surface, but they protect it. You may reflect on how often you were drawn to roles that required stabilization rather than spotlight. You became the one people leaned on when systems wobbled. The one who could hear what wasn't being said. The one who could pause momentum long enough for reality to re-enter the room. You didn't volunteer for this. You were recognized by necessity. Structures seek support instinctively. This role demanded sacrifice, though not the dramatic kind. It required you to remain composed when others released tension outward. It required you to carry unresolved weight without spreading it. Over time, this taught you discernment. You learned which burdens were yours to hold and which were not. You learned when to descend and when to surface. That judgment is rare and earned. There were moments when you wondered if depth meant delay, if grounding meant stagnation. You watched surface actors move faster, gather attention, claim momentum. You stayed where you were, not out of fear, but out of alignment. You sensed that movement without foundation collapses. You waited for solidity, not approval. As this understanding deepens, a new confidence settles in. Not confidence in outcome, but confidence in orientation. You trust where you stand because you know what supports you. You know that when pressure increases, you won't scatter. You'll distribute weight. That knowledge frees you from chasing visibility or validation. Agartha, then, is not a place you return to. It's a principle you embody. A way of being that prioritizes integrity beneath the surface. You carry it with you into every space, whether noticed or not. And because of that, you become a quiet threshold between collapse and coherence. The story moves forward now, not toward revelation, but toward integration. What you carry below will soon meet what you're asked to do above. And when that meeting happens, the depth you come from will finally make sense in motion. Integration is when depth stops being private and starts becoming useful. Not exposed, applied. You feel this shift when situations no longer overwhelm you but invite you. Complexity doesn't feel heavy, it feels familiar. You recognize its shape the way others recognize patterns on the surface. You've lived long enough below the noise to know where pressure collects and where structures fail first. You may notice that people begin to seek you earlier now, not only when things are breaking. They sense that involving you at the right moment prevents collapse later. This isn't because you have answers ready. It's because you know how to hold a question without rushing it into distortion. That ability changes the quality of decisions before they harden into mistake. This is where the Agartha symbolism becomes functional rather than poetic. Depth is no longer just where you come from, it's how you operate. You bring foundational thinking into surface-level action. You slow processes just enough to let reality catch up. You ground ideas before they're released. You stabilize people before they escalate. These actions don't attract attention, but they determine outcomes. You might notice a subtle boundary forming around your energy. You no longer descend for every disturbance. You choose where your depth is required. Not every crack needs bedrock. Not every instability deserves your presence. This discernment protects you from depletion and preserves your capacity for moments where grounding truly matters. Depth, when overused, becomes erosion. You've learned to avoid that. There's also a new clarity in how you relate to your tribe. You don't need to find them all at once. You recognize them by resonance, not proximity. A glance, a pause, a shared tolerance for silence. These connections don't demand maintenance. They endure naturally. They remind you that depth is shared, even when it's unseen. As integration continues, something else shifts. You stop translating yourself constantly. You trust that those who need what you bring will adjust to your pace. You don't simplify to be accepted. You don't harden to be respected. You remain intact, and that intactness becomes your signal. The surface world doesn't need everyone to be loud. It needs enough people to be stable. You are one of those people, not because you chose it, but because your orientation made it inevitable. You didn't escape the surface. You learned how to support it without being consumed by it. The story is no longer about where your tribe lived. It's about how their way of being moves through you. And as that movement becomes visible in action, the next phase begins. Not underground, not above ground, but exactly where depth and reality meet. Where depth and reality meet, responsibility changes its tone. It no longer feels imposed. It feels appropriate. You're not stepping into roles to prove capacity. You're responding because something fits your orientation. This is the difference between being assigned and being placed. Placement doesn't ask you to stretch beyond integrity. It asks you to apply what you already carry. You may notice that your decisions now affect more than immediate outcomes. They influence atmosphere, pace, direction. Not dramatically, but measurably. When you engage, volatility lowers. When you withdraw, instability becomes visible. This contrast isn't something you created, it's something your presence reveals. Depth exposes what the surface tries to ignore. This can feel weighty at first. Not because it burdens you, but because it clarifies consequence. You understand now that where you stand matters. That when you speak, silence follows, not out of reverence, but out of recalibration. People listen differently when words aren't competing with urgency. You don't seek this effect. You respect it. The Agartha principle inside you begins to operate like a compass. When situations pull toward spectacle, you sense misalignment. When they pull toward foundation, you move naturally. This instinct saves time others waste. It prevents errors others repeat. And because it's quiet, it remains sustainable. You don't burn out stabilizing systems, you strengthen them. You might also feel a shift in how you experience leadership. It no longer looks like direction from above. It looks like holding the center. You don't gather followers. You create conditions where coherence can emerge. This is leadership that doesn't scale through volume, but through reliability. People adjust because they trust the ground you stand on. There's a growing ease in your movement now. You don't carry the loneliness of depth the way you once did. Integration has softened it. You see how your way of being connects to outcomes, to people, to continuity. What once felt separate now feels placed. You're no longer translating between worlds. You're operating at their intersection. As this settles, inspiration shifts again. It's no longer about understanding where you come from. It's about honoring it in action. Every time you choose restraint over reaction, grounding over escalation, clarity over speed, you express the depth you carry. And each expression strengthens it further. The story approaches its final movements now. Not with urgency, with inevitability. What remains isn't a revelation about Agartha, it's a realization about you. You were never meant to stay below. You were meant to bring depth into motion. Bringing depth into motion doesn't require force. It requires consistency. You begin to notice how your smallest choices now carry disproportionate effect, not because they're dramatic, but because they're aligned. When you speak, things clarify. When you pause, others slow down. When you disengage, imbalance becomes obvious. You're not directing outcomes, you're revealing structure. This is where many misunderstand what you do. From the outside, it may look passive. Internally, it's precise. You're constantly measuring load, tension, sustainability. You know when something can bear more weight and when it's close to failure. This knowledge doesn't come from theory. It comes from living below the surface long enough to understand what actually holds. You may realize now why chaos never tempted you the way it tempted others. Chaos burns fast. It demands attention but offers no continuity. You were never drawn to it because your orientation was always toward what lasts. Even when you experimented with speed or intensity, something in you pulled back. Not fear, memory. Your system remembered depth even when you tried to ignore it. As your role becomes clearer, so does your selectivity. You no longer engage everywhere you're capable. You engage where your depth makes a real difference. This is not scarcity. It's stewardship. You understand now that spreading yourself thin weakens foundations. Concentration strengthens them. So you choose fewer points of contact, and those points grow stronger because of it. There's also a new clarity in how you experience connection. You don't need many people to feel aligned. You need the right frequency. When someone shares your tolerance for silence, your respect for timing, your resistance to spectacle, you recognize it immediately. These connections feel ancient, even if they're new. They don't demand explanation. They simply hold. You might notice that the surface world begins to adjust around you more readily now. Not because it understands depth, but because it benefits from it. Systems don't need to comprehend foundations to rely on them. They just need them to be there. You don't announce what you're doing. You let results speak quietly over time. This is the moment where Agartha stops being a metaphor and becomes a function. You're no longer identifying with the idea of depth, you're expressing it continuously. In how you decide, in how you wait, in how you refuse to escalate what doesn't need escalation. This expression doesn't drain you. It strengthens you. As the story moves toward its close, one truth becomes undeniable. You were shaped not to escape the surface, but to stabilize it. Not to dominate it, but to support it. Not to be seen as extraordinary, but to remain intact when pressure rises. Only one movement remains now, not about where you belong, but about why you're here at all. And that final understanding is closer than you think. Understanding why you're here doesn't arrive as a mission statement. It arrives as alignment between what you are and what the moment requires. You stop asking where you belong because you can feel when you're needed. Not urgently. Not emotionally. Precisely. The situations that draw you in now are the ones where collapse is possible, but not inevitable, where a small shift in grounding changes the entire outcome. You may notice that your sense of purpose feels quieter than expected. There's no rush to define it, no pressure to explain it to yourself or anyone else. Purpose for you isn't a role to perform. It's a function to maintain. You maintain coherence where fragmentation would be easier. You maintain patience where reaction would be rewarded. You maintain structure where others would chase relief. This is where the Agartha symbolism completes another layer. Depth was never meant to isolate you from the world. It was meant to inform how you engage it. You don't bring answers from below, you bring stability. You don't reveal secrets, you prevent collapse. You operate as a quiet counterweight to excess, a reminder that not everything needs to be accelerated to be real. You might feel a new kind of peace here, not comfort but correctness. The sense that you're no longer resisting your nature or apologizing for it. You don't need to explain why you choose depth over display. You don't need to justify slowness in a fast world. You've seen what happens when speed outruns integrity. You've seen how much damage urgency can disguise. That knowledge anchors you. There's also a shift in how you relate to effort. You're not expending energy to stay grounded anymore. Grounding is your default. Effort now goes toward application, deciding where and when your presence matters most. This makes your impact cleaner and your recovery faster. You don't burn out holding the ground. You stand on it. As this understanding settles, inspiration takes a gentler form. Not aspiration towards something else, but commitment to what already works. You're inspired to continue, not to ascend. To remain, not to escape. To apply depth in a world that rarely notices foundations until they're gone. The story is almost complete now. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because there's nothing left to prove. What you are has found its place in motion. What you carry has found its function in reality. Only one final movement remains. Not a revelation about Agartha. A recognition about you. The final recognition is simple, and that's why it took so long to arrive. You were never searching for your tribe because you were lost. You were recognizing them because you were aligned. Agartha was never a destination or a secret refuge. It was a shared orientation among those who understand that depth sustains what the surface consumes. You see now that your sense of separation was never about not belonging. It was about belonging to something that doesn't need constant validation. Your tribe isn't hidden underground. They're dispersed, placed wherever stability is required. They recognize each other not by signs or symbols, but by how they move through pressure without losing form. This understanding reframes every moment you once labeled as loneliness. You weren't isolated. You were positioned. You weren't overlooked. You were kept intact. The silence you carried wasn't emptiness. It was structure. It allowed you to hear what others missed and to remain grounded when noise overwhelmed the room. There is no call here to retreat from the world or to reveal anything dramatic. The work of depth is ongoing and quiet. It shows up in how you choose timing over reaction, coherence over spectacle, steadiness over speed. These choices don't attract applause. They prevent collapse, and prevention rarely gets credit, but it always matters. You no longer need to search for confirmation that you're different or chosen. Difference was never the point. Function was. You function as a stabilizing presence in unstable systems. You bring grounding where escalation would be easier. You carry continuity into moments that would otherwise fracture. This is not destiny, it's orientation expressed consistently. If there is peace here, it comes from acceptance. Acceptance that you don't need to be fully understood to be effective. Acceptance that depth doesn't require visibility to have impact. Acceptance that your tribe doesn't need to gather physically to exist. They already move through the world doing the same quiet work you do. Agartha lives wherever someone chooses to descend inward before acting outward. It lives wherever patience outlasts urgency. It lives wherever coherence is protected without announcement. And it lives in you, not as a place you return to, but as a way you remain.